And so thank you so much, Patty and Jim and all of the crew there at the Dallas Genealogical Society for allowing me this privilege and this opportunity to share during the Black History Month, a history month that I love and appreciate. And I'm so grateful for the history of African Americans and what it means to me as an individual and what it means to our people. And I call myself the compassionate genealogist because I've come to understand that as we reach back into the past, finding our ancestors requires of us to love them and embrace them and to look beyond whatever situations they find themselves in. Because many times when you find your ancestors, you will find them in difficult situations. And so it's important that you embrace them in order to be able to continue to research. If you don't embrace them and don't love them for whatever situation they are in, and there are many multitudes of situations because all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And then all of us have difficulties in our life that we deal with. So you never know what you're going to find as you go backwards. And so it's important that you be compassionate with them and love them. And so today I thought in our presentation, and Patty, it's changed a little bit since the last time you and I talked and were together in a presentation. It has changed where I brought in new information that I found and new research that I've discovered. And so I thought I would upgrade it just a little bit. And so where are our African-American ancestors? That's the question that we have to find and answer today. I believe we've got to diligently search the records, legal records is where they're found. Much like everybody else, you're going to find African Americans in some of the same places. The difference is how you research them before the Civil War, as well as after the Civil War. That's where the difference in African American research comes into play. Today, we're going to look at before the Civil War, the will and probate records of slave owners, where they bequeathed their slaves to family members and others. Always you'll find that when slave owners owned slaves, they wanted to keep them in the family and it was a source of wealth, and so they handed them off to their family. You'll find them in deed records there, and that actually gave proof of a transfer of a slave to anyone. And find them in plantation records, and there are some indexes for some records that are in the Dallas Library. You want to look for the comprehensive index of American slaves. If you go to the Dallas Library, and not only the Dallas Library, that book is in many libraries throughout the country. It gives estate records, it gives plantation owners, it gives the names of the enslaved, and they actually talk about their enslavement in that particular book because they're based off of the slave narratives that were a part of the Writers Project from 19 and 24 through 35. And so what you'll find is that these records are there, and they're in that index called the Comprehensive Guide to the African-American Slave, or to the American slave. And then there are other records like tax records and vital records and records that you'll also be able to find in courthouses. There's a wonderful book that is now on familysearch.org, and you'll also find it in your libraries and on ancestry.com. You'll find a book by Edith Smith and Vivian Leman, who are actually residents of Mesquite. Edith Smith is no longer alive, but her daughter Vivian is, and they work diligently throughout the state of Texas to find the slaves and to try to find them in their habitation and present an index where they could be found. And so the name of that book is No Land and Only Slaves. Wonderful, wonderful research that gives you the name of slave owners as well as slaves. And then you want to look in the 1790 to the 1840 head of household census, the 1850 through the 1860 slave schedules. And all of this is before the Civil War. these records are key if you're going to find your African-American ancestors before the Civil War. Then after the Civil War, you want to diligently search legal records like the 1870 to the 1940 United States Census, the 1867 voter registration. The Freemans Bureau and the Freeman Bank records are outstanding websites that will help you find your family. Records of in the United States colored troops in the Civil War, and you can go to Fold 3 and find those. Those are out there, and they'll help you tremendously. I found a great deal in Fold 3 with finding my ancestors that were a part of the United States military. And then death certificates are always important to helping you trace family and to know who family actually was. And so as we begin our research today, we want to start with understanding the importance of when researching African Americans, how names were important. So important that in slavery, most African Americans had no surnames. And they were enslaved people. And so they usually either took the name of their owner or they had no surname at all. And when recorded in records, you won't usually find a surname attached.
Dr. Turner, we've lost your audio.
It's muted. I don't know why it would mute it. Okay, am I back?
You're back. Yes.
Okay. All right, good. So what did you hear last, Patty?
Right after the surnames.
Oh, okay.
The surnames. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so most enslaved people had no surnames, and I think you guys heard that. But the end of the Civil War created the need to find a name. And so what you'll find is that if they had a name before the Civil War, they may have took a slave owner's name, but then after the Civil War, they developed names for themselves. A lot of times they would go back to the very first slave owner, or maybe they had some people in the community that they respected and they named themselves after that person in the community. And so finding where they got their actual surnames from is very, very difficult. But at the end of the Civil War, the United States government required that all newly freed African Americans would find a surname. And so what you'll find is that families began to try and connect with surnames. And so when looking for your family, surnames were important for them. And am I still with you guys? Okay. And so surnames were important. And so they developed the surname. Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir. You're doing good.
Okay. I just noticed my slide didn't change as fluidly as I would like for it to. And so when you look at the difference between surnames and the names that we call ourselves, we'll always record it in records. And they listed us by an identity and ethnicity. And that's been the case in America, and it's still the case in America. And so African Americans in this country, when researching us, have undergone numerous name changes regarding our racial identity. For a long time, the N word was used, and it's become a word that is scorned today, and a word, the word in, and everybody knows what that word is. It's not an acceptable term, but it was very common. It was very common in 1865 and beyond to have used that in there N-word. African Americans used it, everybody in society used it. And so if you're starting to research African American history, you're going to have to adjust to seeing the N-word in literature, seeing the N-word being used by African Americans as well as people of other ethnicities. We went from using the N-word to the term Negro, to colored, to African Americans and Afro-Americans, Black Americans. And there's no other nationality that has had so many different race-related identifications over the course of American history. You'll find this quote in my book, God's Amazing Grace, Reconciling 4 Centuries of African American Marriages and Families. And so, looking for African American families, the census from 1790, before the Civil War, to 1860 provide a great deal of research for us. When looking for them, we must understand that from 1790 to 1840, the census records only recorded head of households. And in recording head of households, only the head of household was named. And so here is a copy of a census record from 1840 that represents where my family was enslaved. And if you'll notice, it just says slaves and gives their gender, and then it gives an age range. For instance, the first slave there is under 10 through 18. That's a large range. And so here what you'll find is that they were there. If you know the name of your former owners, you can always look for that age range that your relative falls in and try. Then the only person who is listed here in a name is going to be the head of the household. Women were not mentioned, children were not mentioned, even though they were white. And if you look at that, you'll see that their names were not mentioned either, which makes it very, very difficult for everyone trying to do their ancestry research. But then you have the slave schedules that also are a part of the African American census. Starting in 1850 and 1860, they were removed from household, African Americans were, and they were put on a slave schedule. The slave schedule represents just the name of the owner, as well as the age of the individual, the gender of the individual, and then it puts the race of the individual. And most slave owners had certain number of houses that their slave lived in. And so it gives you a number of houses that were actually on that plantation. That gives you a little idea of how your family may have lived, whether they were 3 to a house. For instance, this one here, there are 4 slaves and there are 2 houses. And so they were fairly comfortable. That was not the case with all African Americans during this particular time. Some of them were crowded into smaller spaces. But then there were not always African Americans who were enslaved. There was some free. What we have to understand is that during the time of our country, throughout history, 89% of all African Americans were enslaved. At the end of 1865, E. Franklin Frazier wrote a book in the 30s that determined that throughout slavery, 89% of all African Americans were enslaved, as well as 11% were free. Here is a free family, a Lucinda Huff or Ruff, and she has with her all of her children. I believe there are 6 children there. They were all free. I pulled this out because this woman was some way connected to the slave owners of my family, and they actually allowed her freedom. There was always someone who had to oversee, an Anglo person who had to oversee African Americans who were free. And so she served, evidently, these slave owners served as an advisor to this lady, although she is listed on the census. She is listed on the 1860 and 1850 census as a free African Americans. So not all African Americans were enslaved. And if you're fortunate enough to find your family, what a wonderful thing. And then we have from the 1870 census, and it can be your guide to getting beyond the brick wall. In the 1870 census, you need to look closely at those records. If you can find your family on that 1870 census, then you may be able to break the brick with ease. And the 1870 brick wall, and we call it the 1870 brick wall because that's usually as far back as most people can get. They can't jump that wall in order to be able to find their family on the other side of it because the records change so tremendously. But here in the highlight is all of my family. They were living together. They were living close together in Burnham, Texas, just outside of Ennis, Texas. And they were right there together on that 1870 census. Everybody highlighted in yellow is family. My grandfather Warren, and you have to look at the transcripts and you look at your family members closely because the transcripts often were wrong. The translators didn't understand what people were really saying a lot of times, and they did their best to get an understanding and to transcribe it the best that they could. But many times they were in error. For instance, if you see the second highlighted person is William Turner, but actually his name was Warren Turner. And I know this is my family because the baby there is my grand aunt, who I know was my grand aunt. And then the name of my great grandmother is Eleanor on here when her name was Elvira. And so there were a lot of transcripts, but the people beneath them are family member, but we didn't know. We had no idea who these people were. But this census reveals that Abe and Lucy and Gray and Alexander were all family. And then if you drop down at the bottom, there's another Lizzie Turner that's there. And so I say, when you're looking at the 1870 census, look closely at it, and you may find your family all living close together. And they stayed close to one another for many different reasons. And so look at the birthplace as well. It'll tell you where they felt like they were born. They all got together. They said, okay, we're from Georgia, or they knew they were from Georgia. And so this gives you an idea of where you need to go back beyond the 1870 brick wall to try to find your ancestors. If they were from Georgia, then you look for a slave owner that was from Georgia living in the same location, and you just may be onto something. And if you're fortunate enough to find the name of your ancestor later on in documents beyond the brick wall, that are tied into a particular slave owner that now lived in the area that your people were after slavery, then you have found a nugget. And so take note of the young women's names because they often change. The woman at the very, very top, her name is Emily Neal, and she was my great-grandfather's sister, and she actually was married to a gentleman who kept the name of the former slave owner. And his name is Alan Neal, and he's on the previous page. But this gave me contact with my family back into slavery because they were all born before freedom. And so take note of their names, and that will give you some guideline into the families that you need to research. And so the ages of those individuals all tell you whether they were born enslaved or whether they were born in freedom. And so in order to help me solidify and to give me a picture of how my family existed, whether they were free, whether they were enslaved, I developed this chart. And most pedigree charts go from right to left. But I developed this one from left to right, or from right to left, because I wanted to be able to look back into the future. And maybe it's because I'm a little bit dyslexic. I wanted to be able to look backwards. And so, but here is my family on one side of the brick wall. All of the people inside of the brick wall were enslaved people. All the people on the outside of the brick wall were free ancestors. And if you look at this, not many of my ancestors have been free so far. Going beyond my paternal grandparents, most of my ancestors were enslaved or born into slavery. And so when I look at this, it always says to me how important it is for us to know just how close slavery was to us and how far we've actually come since the days of slavery. And so here, if you look down here at the bottom, these are some of my Anglo ancestors that were my mother's father's grandparents, and they are my great grandparents, and so second great grandparents. And so this is the chart that I think all of us ought to develop who are African Americans to chart and record your ancestors beyond the brick wall. And so the 1870 brick wall. And so break through it, whether you got to go over it, whether you've got to go under it, or whether you've got to go around it, however you need to do, whatever you need to do to get through that 1870 brick wall is what you have to do. And so this is Warren Turner. We talked about him a little bit earlier. And this is a lifetime of federal census, another chart that I developed just to get an understanding of their life, to know a little bit about them. And so I have him charted from 1870 to 1900. The 1870 census was the first census he was on. And it shows every time he said where he was born in Georgia. Said he didn't know whether his mother or his father was born. His birthdays were always a different year. He never gave the same year for his birthday, always a different year of 1846, 1849, 1847, but none of those were actually right. And so not being able to read or write determined whether he could actually give a legitimate date for his birthday. And so here, when you look at this chart, it says the places he lived, just a visual for you to keep up with your ancestors. He was always a farmer. He rented his home for a while, but then if you look to the far right at the bottom, by 1905, he owned his own home. He bought a 80-acre farm in Springer or Seward, Oklahoma, and that farm stayed in our family until the 60s, 1960. And so chart your ancestors through the federal census. And then what you will find sometimes, this is my great-grandmother Elvira Turner and her lifetime census, she changed where she was born consistently. She never knew really where she was born. I don't think. First she said Georgia, then she said Virginia, then she said Texas, then she said Tennessee. She has made it very, very difficult for me to chart her and to trace her back, simply because the places of her birth changed so tremendously. Her birth year changed every census. Her number of children, it let me know here for her, which was very important, that she had a child that died. In the 1900 census, the first time she mentions her children, she had one child that died, and that let me know that I needed to search the graveyard somewhere to be able to find that child, and I did find her, and we'll talk a little bit about her in a little bit later. But here we find where I wanted to develop a Texas connection. It let me know where my ancestors came from, but then how they migrated to Texas. And so I defined here for you my parental grandparents, my maternal grandparents, my maternal great-grandparents, my maternal great-great-grandparents, and my maternal second great-grandparents, all from the census records to show where they lived in Texas, how they came together, how they may have been connected with one another, the counties that were located close to one another, in order to give me some idea, and you may want to do this as well, as to where your family was, where they lived, and where they actually came from, just so that you'll have a running chart of who they were. So finding them will help you identify with that connection. And then look for your ancestors in DNA. I love this picture. This is a picture of the Dahomey tribe from Africa, and my DNA on Ancestry.com shared with me that the Dahomey tribe was one of the tribes that my ancestors are from. And I found a very interesting thing about the Dahomey tribe is that they had the last illegal international slave ship to transport slaves to America in 1859, 1861. They arrived in the Gulf of Mexico at Mobile, Alabama. The ship flotilla brought captives from the African tribes of the Wada and Dahomey, who sold slaves to the slave traders. And so this is a picture of a king that's a Dahomey king. And there is 28% of my DNA that is from the Dahomey tribe. This is my ethnicity chart and a breakdown of all of my ethnicity. And when you get your DNA on Ancestry.com, you get a chart similar to this. I've readjusted it so that it may work a little bit better for this presentation. But if you look at the right side of it, just over Africa, you'll see that I have 89% of my DNA from Africa. 49% of it is Nigerian. Then 28% of it is Benin, Togo. That's where the Dahomey tribe comes from. 16% of my DNA is Cameroon, Congo, Southern Bantu peoples. And then I have 10 to 11% that are from Anglo societies, 5% from Europe, 4% from Wales, 2% from Ireland. And so knowing your ethnicity will help you to be able to trace your ancestors back, because the goal of all African Americans is to be able to trace their ancestors back to Africa. And so this gives us a breakdown of who we are and where we came from, and the ethnicity that we can trace back if we're looking to get back to Africa. And the previous slide that I showed you of the slave ship says that some of those people could have actually been my people, because the Benin Togo people and the Dahomey people, we know one of the last slave ships to actually come to America, landing in Mobile. And I have ancestry that a lot of it is from Alabama. And so when we look at further research that can be done for African Americans finding their ancestors, the Freemans Bureau is a great source. The Freemans Bureau was looking for and assimilating African Americans from 1865 to 1872. That is after the Civil War. The Freemans Bureau kicked in order to help African Americans to be assimilated into society, and they collected information from people who were actually looking for their ancestors. And so when they went around, if you were looking for your ancestors and you were sold away during slavery, what they did was they took these records and they recorded these records. Now, here is my maternal second great grandfather, Peter Alexander. Somebody was looking for him, or he was looking for someone. It really doesn't define which one it is very well, whether he was looking for somebody or somebody was looking for him. But it does show on the Freemans Bureau And records there that show us where he was from. He was from Honaco, Virginia. The account was taken on April the 9th, 1870. And his birthplace was Goochland. That's also in Virginia. And that he was a male, and gave us his name. And the good thing about the Freemans Bureau is that if they found an ancestor of yours, and they would make sure that they made that connection if they had two people who were trying to find each other. And so here is another record, and it shows you just how bad these records were. But if you really look at them, it will give you a great reward if you can work through it. And in working through it, it gave me the names of all of my second great maternal grandfather's siblings, his parents' name. His father's name was John. His mother's name was Matilda. I would not have ever known that information had I not. I knew that through research that I found my grandfather, my great-grandfather, on a census record with him, but I never would have known his sibling's name or his parents' name. His mother's name was Matilda. He had a brother named Harriet, and a sister named Harriet, I'm sorry, and another sister named Myra. And so Peter Alexander was my second great grandfather, and the Census Bureau rewarded me by showing me that also his brother, Chaz Alexander, was looking for family. Both of them evidently filed census records. They were looking for one another. They listed each other on the census records. And in listing each other on the census records, there was a connection that happened. And when you're looking for your lost family, they were looking for lost family, and they were able to make that connection with each other. Now, the wonderful thing about this is through Ancestry.com, I was rewarded tremendously with a DNA match to Peter Alexander's family. And I blacked out their names to try and keep them, without exposing them, because I don't have their permission. But this DNA record shows that Peter Alexander had a sister by the name of Mara. She married a guy by the name of Jackson, and the dad's name of them was John. So this is through lines, and through lines is a ancestry.com data bank that goes out, finds trees, and connects the trees to DNA matches. And I was connected to this DNA match that also is a connection to my fourth great grandfather, or my third great grandfather, John Alexander. And so here is a great DNA match that shows that Freemans Bureau opened this record up. And then when the Freemans bringing it together with the DNA match really was a great reward. And then search the military records of African Americans that have served in every American conflict. And that's one of the things we have to understand. African Americans have always fought for this country. They've always been active in service. And I'm excited that these DNA records on Fold 3, as well as these ancestry records on Fold 3, have been able to make connections for me and my family. I want to share with you my grand uncle Henry Johnson. He is buried in the family cemetery in Seward, Oklahoma. And my dad died when I was 9 years old. And so I really didn't have a great deal of knowledge about my dad's mother's side. I knew her name was Ida. I thought she might have been named Ida Johnson, but I did not know definitely what her name was. And every year after my dad died, my mom and I would go out to the cemetery. We would clean off the graves. And my mother would always say, "Baby, put some flowers on Uncle Henry's grave." And we would put flowers on his grave. And I asked her one year, I said, Mom, who is Uncle Henry? And she said, I don't know, baby. Those are some of your daddy's people. And so I had no idea who they were. And yet, when I started my family research, my thought that you need to check and see who Henry W. Johnson is. He was a private in World War I of the 804 Pioneer Infantry. He died October 20th, 1922, was buried in the cemetery. And when I began the research on Henry Johnson, it opened up a world of research for me into my father's mother's side of the family, the Johnson family, which has just exploded as far as going back into the years of 1810, 1815, and finding documentation beyond the brick wall. But here is my uncle, Hazel Turner. He was a World War II casualty, and I'd never heard of Hazel Turner. My dad was born in 1911. 1909. My mom was born in 1911. And so my parents were quite old when I was born. And so their siblings had long passed. But here is Henry Hazel Turner, who was killed in the Solomon Islands. And during the time that he was killed in the Solomon Islands, they buried him on the island. They exhumed his body, brought it back to the Veterans Cemetery in the Pacific, and had him buried there. It gives me information about him. He was a part of the transportation unit in World War II, but I never knew about my dad's siblings. And doing ancestry research has opened up that world. My dad had 3 brothers that I knew nothing about. Our family never talked about them. There was Hazel, there was Ether Lee, and there was Freddie Lee. 3 brothers that never ever talked about in our family. It never came to my mind until I started doing family research and began to explore my ancestry. And so I'm excited to say that he wasn't the only one that served in the military, but he had a brother by the name of Wilbur, a sister by the name of Cyrilla, who were all World War II veterans. And so look for your ancestry in Fold 3 or in military records. And then diligently search legal records. Spend time searching court clerk records. And one of the things you may want to do if you are not in the county or the city or the state of the records you're wanting to search is call the court clerk's office in that area and ask them if they have an online database that you can research on. And they'll be happy to help you with your research. That's to me was exciting because through the online research, I've been able to research my family back to this will of a slave owner by the name of John Tripp, Major John Tripp, he was called. And I found in his will my 4th great grandmother, my 3rd great grandmother, and it let me know how important will and probate records of slave owners are to African Americans. Because if we're going to be recorded, it's more than likely that we're going to be recorded as a bequeath to one of their family members. And this is an item here of the will. It says, I give to my daughter, Sally Pope, 1 Negro woman, Nancy, and Delcy uncapitalized, signifying that she was a child, and all the cattle and other things I have here to given her. And so consequently, what you'll find is that some of the best records you're going to find are going to be wills. And so jumping from that, who this gentleman, William Biggins, was the executor of John Tripp's estate. Somehow or another, Delsey was transferred to him. And if you look in the highlights of the yellow, when he died in 1817, Delsey then is mentioned again as a woman now. And as a woman, she has children. Her oldest was Abraham. The next was young Lucy and Catherine. Remember, we talked about Lucy being on the 1870 census with my grandfather, Warren, in Burnham, Texas. And so from 1870, I found here. But you've got to be diligent in your search, and you got to look through these probates. And the key is knowing who one slave owner was and being able to trace those records going backwards. And so that's been exciting for me to be able to find that out, and just so grateful for the doors being open for that. But then following the 1865 emancipation of Africa, many of the slave owners that owned our people moved to Texas. And what happened was Texas was a state that they thought would maintain their slaves even after the Civil War. And so they thought by moving to Texas that they would be able to maintain them. And so when looking for my ancestors after the Civil War, this record came into existence and opened up another door to who my ancestors were. Remember, we saw Abe on the 1870 census living next to my great grandfather, Warren Turner. And then we saw Emily living next door to him as well. But then it ties it in to my grand uncles and my grandpa, because this was a probate record over some land that their brother Gray owned, who was also on that 1870 census. And so this probate record here of land tied my family to these people and gave me a second solidification of my ancestors going back just beyond this side of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so when you look at the names of those people were all my grandfather spouses. And so this is a record that is from the Ellis County Court Clerk. It's an online database. And if you look down here at the bottom, you can go online and you can do just a multitude of research, not only in the Waxahachie, Ennis, but it also has other surrounding counties that are part of this database as well. And so if you're researching in Texas or any other part of the country, you don't always have to go to that area. If you call the county court clerk's office, they will share with you whether you can do online research or not. And so here's my family, the first free people born into freedom, along with their mother, who was not born into freedom, Elvira and her children. And these are all my family members that are in Seward, Oklahoma, where they moved around 1888 and 1899 from Ennis, Texas to Seward, Oklahoma. And just being in contact with family allowed us to produce all of these pictures. My grandfather is in the top right-hand corner. His name was Levi, born 1887. And I got that picture from my aunt, who was my step-aunt. And she said, I've got a picture of my daddy. And she said he was the only daddy I ever knew. And she loved him very much. And she gave me this picture. And then the picture of Elvira was a picture that came in a frame that my brother Roosevelt and my sisters all took from my Aunt Cyrilla's house. She raised my Aunt Cyrilla after the death of their mother at a very young age, the Elvira. And so it was important for her to keep that picture in that frame, a very old picture in a very old frame that for years nobody knew who they were, who she was. And I was able to determine who she was. And if you see, look at her in the middle, she has a great resemblance to her children. So these are all my grandfather's siblings, and and then in the tombstone here in the right-hand corner at the bottom is the one that Elvira said was deceased, that we talked about a little bit earlier, recognizing on all of the census records each year that she had one child that passed. In 1885, this child is buried in Ennis, Texas, in the Templeton Cemetery there in Ennis, Texas. And so you want to go from there, we'll go from there and we'll look at marriage records. If you find an original marriage record, this is Warren and Elvira's original marriage record. They were born in February of 1869, and it's just very difficult to read. So I transcribed it for our family, and this is the transcription of it. When you look at this record and you look at it in depthly, you will see the name of W.H. Getz at the bottom there in the highlight. W.H. Getz was a key find for me in understanding who the slave owners were of my family. Although W.H. Getz never owned any slave, his wife did. And his wife at one time was married to the original slave owner of my family. And so that gave me a connection going back all the way back to Georgia. And then if you look at the preacher who married, he was also a part of the move that came from Georgia to Texas just before the Civil War in the 1850s. This preacher here married many couples. And W.H. Getz signed off on them as a witness to the fact that their marriages were legitimate and legal, which was normally the case for African Americans just after slavery, because marriages in slavery were not legal. They needed someone to clarify and give credence to the fact that that marriage was a legal marriage. And so when you're looking for your male ancestors, look into the 1867 and the 1882 voter registration. And in the voter registration is much information if it's filled out correctly. When it's filled out, a true blessing to help solidify where your family came from. Here is a good one. This is a good one that was done on Warren Turner in Ennis, Texas, and it gives us when he came to the state, how long he had been in the county, and how long he had been in the precinct. And each of them says 13 years, which lets me know that in 1867, if I go back 13 years, that it was in the 50s, around 53, 54, that he actually came to the state of Texas, came to Ellis County, and lived in that same precinct all of that time. And you'll see the yellow dots going across Warren Turner. Waxahachie is where he said the precinct he was in, and 13, 13, 13 across. But then on the second page, and never ignore the second page, it gives us where he is from, Georgia. Georgia, having traced him back, and then it gives his name again. And then in that final remarks column, it lets us know that he was also an African American, or at that time they were called colored. And so this is a good one. But on Peter Alexander, evidently the registrar was very, very lazy and put down none of the vital information that would help me at all, other than the fact that he was from Virginia. And so when searching online, you want to also look at archived newspapers. And for the folk in Texas, the portal to Texas history is a great site. If you've not researched that site, you want to go to it and you want to look at it. I have been extremely blessed by the research that I've been able to find online through papers. Before the Civil War, here's Warren in a newspaper in Hancock, Texas, for a slave auction. And I found him, a 4-year-old boy, in the slave auction, along with his Aunt Catherine, along with the gentleman I believe to be his grandfather, Rochester, who was 60 years old, Delcy. And we've talked quite a bit about Delcy, but this is not the same Delcy. This is the Delcy who is the daughter of Catherine, and they're all found in the census records in Ennis, Texas. But here they are in Hancock, Georgia, and we know that they ended up in Ennis, Texas after the Civil War. And Catherine also had a son by the name of John. Haven't talked much about the Lady Isabel next to John down there, but Isabel was also Lucy's sister. I believe at this time, Lucy is no longer with the family. This is the first record in 1843 that Lucy is not listed. And I have numerous records before this where Lucy was listed with them. So I believe she has now left these former slave owner who was John Bishop and has gone to reside with a new slave owner who I believe to have been the parent of Thomas Neal's wife. And so Thomas Neal, I believe, was our slave owner in Texas. And I believe that his wife actually owned Lucy, her as a wedding gift. And I found that record as well. And so when you look at archived newspapers, they will give you a whole lot. After the Civil War, this is Emily Neal again. And this is an article that I found on the portal to Texas, the Dallas Express newspaper. And it talks about the fact that Emily Neal was one of the first colored settlers of Ennis, a charter member of St. Paul Baptist Church, died Sunday night. Mrs. Neal was 80 years of age and well known and liked by both races. And it was exciting for me to find this in the Dallas Express newspaper, which was one of the African-American newspapers in the early 1900s that existed in Dallas. And then you want to look for newspaper and where I found the previous article of Warner and slave auction on the Georgia Historic Newspapers. And on that news site, you can browse by type, which when you look at it, it'll give you type. One of the types would be African-American newspapers. And then the Gateway to Oklahoma History is a wonderful site. On that site, because Oklahoma was thought to be a state that might become an African-American state, solely African-Americans in that state. Of course, we know it didn't turn out that way. There are 2,882 African-American newspapers and back into the 1800s, moving forward on the Gateway to Oklahoma history. And then newspapers by ancestry, a wonderful site that you'll be able to find a tremendous amount of information on your ancestry, on the newspapers by ancestry, which is an archived newspaper site. That one is a newspaper site that will require a subscription. You will have to get it through ancestry.com, or you can buy it outright through Newspapers by Ancestry. And so it's up to you whether you want to pay, but I think it's a very, very good investment. And then finally, as we conclude here today, I wanted to end with a note one of the great finds of mine was my grand uncle, and you've seen his picture before, William Turner. He was a journalist, a farmer, and a preacher. He was born 1879 to 1835. He actually wrote for one of the newspapers in Oklahoma called the Black Dispatch, and he wrote articles from 1917 to 1922. And in writing those articles, William Turner talked often about our family. And so I've learned a lot in those articles. He talked about the farm and how the crops were growing and how the season was, and whether it was a rainy season or whether the winter was cold. And not only that, he was an advocate for civil rights in the early 1900s. And here he writes an article to the Oklahoma Safeguard, which was an African-American newspaper in Oklahoma at the time, refuting an article that said that Negroes would not work without a boss. And he writes this articles, and he said, the Negro will work. He needs no boss. How exciting for me to find this article, because I too am a journalist. I too am a preacher, but I've never been a farmer. But I'm just grateful that being able to do research has been a wonderful experience for me to solidify my ancestry, as well as to break down the connections and how multi-generation flows down to each of us. And when I look at Uncle William, I can see multi-generational experiences flowing down even to me. And so, Patty, that concludes my presentation today. And I hope you've been blessed by it. And I
Oh,
hope
my
you've enjoyed it.
goodness. Absolutely.